3. The end of ink. Why paper was always about to disappear. The prediction. What we thought. By the mid-1990s, the fate of print newspapers seemed sealed. Once news could be transmitted instantly, globally, and at near zero cost, the logic was brutally simple. Paper would become unnecessary. Newspapers, with their presses, trucks, deadlines, and physical distribution, looked like artifacts of a slower age. Digital screens promised infinite pages, constant updates, multimedia storytelling, and perfect personalization. Why wait for tomorrow's paper when the news could arrive now? The prediction was not merely that newspapers would decline, it was that they would end, and soon. Many forecasts placed their disappearance somewhere between 2005 and 2015. Print journalism, it was said, would migrate fully to digital formats. Readers would carry tablets instead of broadsheets. Newsstands would vanish. Ink would give way to pixels. Standing in 1999, this felt less like provocation and more like arithmetic. Why this prediction made sense in 1999? To understand why the death of print felt inevitable, it's essential to remember how dominant newspapers still were at the end of the 20th century, and how suddenly that dominance appeared threatened. In 1999, newspapers remained central to public life. Morning papers landed on doorsteps. Commuters folded them open on trains and buses. Classified ads funded local journalism. Entire cities shared a common information rhythm shaped by daily deadlines. If something mattered, it appeared in print. At the same time, cracks were forming. The internet had introduced a radically different relationship with information. News could now be instant, rather than delayed. Searchable, rather than browsed. Free, rather than purchased. Continuously updated, rather than fixed. For the first time, readers could check headlines multiple times a day. Breaking news no longer waited for the morning edition. Email newsletters, early news websites, and portals like Yahoo News hinted at a future where information was fluid rather than packaged. Crucially, this was happening before smartphones, before social media, and before broadband was universal. Even in this limited form, digital news already felt faster and more convenient than print. It didn't require imagination to see where the trend pointed. There was also a strong economic argument. Printing and distributing newspapers was expensive. Digital publishing was cheap. Advertising dollars, it was assumed, would naturally follow attention online. Once revenue migrated, the logic went, print would collapse under its own cost structure. Layered on top of this was the emotional atmosphere of the time. The approach of the new millennium carried a powerful sense of renewal. Old systems were expected to fall away. New ones would replace them cleanly. Few technologies symbolized the 20th century more clearly than ink on paper. Predicting its demise felt like participating in history's forward motion. And for younger readers today, it's worth emphasizing just how early this was. In 1999, most people still got their news from print or television. Reading news on a screen was often uncomfortable and slow. Portable digital reading devices were rare and crude. The idea of scrolling endlessly through headlines all day was not yet a habit. From that world, it was reasonable to believe print had only a few years left. Who said it, and where? One of the most influential voices behind this prediction was Nicholas Negroponte, founder of the MIT Media Lab. In his 1995 book Being Digital, Negroponte argued that the world was moving from atoms to bits. Physical media, newspapers, CDs, videotapes, would be replaced by digital equivalents that were lighter, faster, and infinitely replicable. Once information became digital, there was little reason to bind it to paper. Negroponte was not a fringe commentator. He was a respected technologist, academic, and public intellectual whose ideas circulated widely among policymakers, executives, and journalists. His writing captured the spirit of the age, confident, elegant, and rooted in the visible momentum of digitization. Importantly, he did not present the decline of print as a tragedy. He framed it as progress. Digital media would be more democratic, more efficient, and more responsive to individual needs. Print's disappearance was not a loss. It was a necessary step toward a more flexible information ecosystem. By the late 1990s, variations of this argument had become mainstream. The question was no longer if newspapers would die, but how quickly. What actually happened 2000 to 2025? Print newspapers did decline dramatically. From the early 2000s onward, circulation fell year after year. Advertising revenue migrated online, then to search engines and social platforms. newsrooms shrank. Local papers closed or consolidated. Entire categories of print advertising, especially classifieds, evaporated almost overnight. By the 2010s, it was clear that the newspaper industry had been permanently altered. And yet, print did not disappear. Instead, it contracted, adapted, and redefined itself. Many newspapers shifted to hybrid models, maintaining print editions while investing heavily in digital subscriptions. Print runs shrank but did not vanish. Physical papers became thinner, more selective, and often more expensive. In some cities, daily print editions turned into weekend products. In others, they became premium offerings aimed at loyal, older readers. Meanwhile, digital news exploded, but not always in the way envisioned in 1999. News consumption fragmented across websites, apps, newsletters, podcasts, and social feeds. Algorithms shaped exposure. Speed often beat depth. The economics of attention favored scale over locality. Ironically, some of the most trusted journalism remained tied to print brands, even as consumption shifted online. The newspaper as a physical object weakened, but the newspaper as an institution proved more resilient. By 2025, print newspapers were no longer the default way people consume news, but they were not relics either. They occupied a smaller, more niche role in the information ecosystem, valued for depth, ritual, and credibility rather than immediacy. The ink did not vanish. It retreated. Verdict. Status. Partially realized. The prediction correctly identified the decline of print's dominance, but overstated the finality of its disappearance. Newspapers lost their central role as the primary news medium. Digital delivery became dominant. But print itself did not die. It evolved into a secondary, specialized format, less frequent, more curated, and more symbolic than functional. The future arrived, but it did not cleanly erase the past. Why it played out this way? The core mistake was assuming that efficiency alone determines media survival. Digital news is faster, cheaper, and more flexible than print. That much proved true. But media is not consumed purely on efficiency grounds. Habit, trust, identity, and ritual matter. For many readers, the physical newspaper represented credibility and seriousness in a way early digital platforms did not. There was also an institutional lag. Newspapers were not just delivery mechanisms. They were organizations with brand recognition, editorial standards, and social authority. Those assets translated imperfectly, but not uselessly, into the digital era. Finally, the prediction underestimated how messy the digital news environment would become. The expectation in the 1990s was that digital news would be better organized, more rational, and more informative. In practice, abundance created noise, polarization, and incentives misaligned with journalism's traditional goals. In that context, print survived not because it was superior, but because it offered constraint, a limited edited slice of information in an otherwise overwhelming media landscape. What this prediction teaches us about the future. This case illustrates a recurring theme. Old technologies rarely disappear outright. They shrink, specialize, and find new meanings. Predictions about replacement tend to assume clean transitions. Reality favors layering. New systems emerge on top of old ones, displacing some functions while preserving others. Cultural artifacts persist long after their practical necessity fades. In 1999, it felt obvious that digital media would eliminate print. What was less obvious was that abundance would make scarcity and the discipline it imposes valuable again. One-sentence takeaway. Print newspapers lost their dominance, but not their relevance. The end of ink turned out to be a long retreat, not a disappearance.